Welcome, welcome, welcome to Survive the JIVE Talk. It's another live stream where I'll be going in detail into a new scientific study on ancient DNA. Unfortunately, I've not been very well. I've recently came down with that thing that's going around, and I'm over it, but I'm still a bit weak. So won't be my normal sprightly self this evening. So please forgive any brain fog, but I'll do my best to go through what the paper shows, what they claim, what the authors claim, how the media's reporting on it, and how it's being interpreted by amateur geneticists who I think often have a better take than the authors of the papers themselves. And I'll leave it to you to make your own mind up on what's the best interpretation. This is not on the Survive the Jive channel, you may have noticed. This is on the Jive Talks channel. I have a separate channel for it now. This is the second Jive Talk that's occurred on this channel. There will never be any on the other channel again, because it's to do with the algorithm. YouTube's algorithm favours a certain kind of... It tries to understand what kind of videos you're making, and it gets confused when I make such different types of videos, so that if people don't like live streams and they don't click on my live streams, then they won't be shown my other kinds of videos either, because YouTube will think they don't like my videos anymore, when really they just don't like the live streams. So I think the people who like the live streams should just subscribe a separate channel so they can keep watching the live streams. I haven't got the donate stuff sorted out yet on this channel, so I can't do super chats, but I think that I should be allowed them soon. But I guess there's no super chats right now. Never mind. You can still donate to Survive the Jive through a whole range of different options, which I've linked to on my link tree in the chat. So if you want to be generous, then you can help me out there. So let's have a look at the paper quickly. I'll just switch to the old notes. Here we go. So yeah, it's by Patterson and colleagues, and it's entitled Large-Scale Migration into Britain During the Middle to Late Bronze Age. So a whole load of authors, as is typical for these kind of papers. And not all of them are geneticists. You get a mixture of geneticists and historians advising and archaeologists advising. One of the historians advising is Barry Cunliffe, and he is a well-known author on the subject of ancient Celts, because he has a rather marginal and controversial theory called Celtic from the West, which is that the Celtic languages evolved in the Atlantic region. And I think it's complete bollocks, but it comes from this evidence of a sort of transatlantic zone of similar bell beaker culture artifacts, material cultures in the Bronze Age, going all along, Iberia, up the Atlantic coast of France, and into Ireland and Britain. So there are similarities, and there is a cultural exchange, and that they all were invaded by the Beaker folk around 2500 BC. So that's why there's a material culture that's the same. But it's a stupid theory, because just because those cultures were the same doesn't mean that those were Celtic, or even that they had same material culture. That indicates that they probably did have at least a mutually intelligible language was spoken across the Atlantic seaboard in the Bronze Age, but I don't think it was Celtic language. And I think that, like archaeologists, if you're going to try and attach a language to material culture, and make POTS people, or at least POTS languages, then you need to... Well, what they've seen is that the known Celtic language, the language speakers from the historical period when the Romans and Greeks start talking about them, they are associated with a culture that grew out of Central Europe, the Hallstatt and stuff. And that culture is the Hallstatt, Central European Bronze Age is the origin of so much of the stuff that we later call Celtic. So it makes much more sense to say that is the origin of Celtic. But then, of course, we don't know what that language that was spoken on the Atlantic seaboard by Bronze Age people there was. But it wasn't Celtic. It would have been an Indo-European language, and there were connections, but I don't see any reason why we should call it Celtic. And the accepted idea among archaeologists has been that the Celtic languages must have come to Britain when you start to see associated archaeological finds in Britain, and that's at the beginning of the Iron Age. That's when you start getting the material culture associated with Celts arriving. Now, I don't know what influence Barry Cunliffe had on this paper, but they've gone with a fringe linguistic idea of Celtic emerging much earlier. They haven't said that Celtic emerged from Britain. They've thought of it as being imported from France in the Bronze Age. So that's earlier than the Celtic culture arrives. The Celtic material culture arrives later. But they are showing through DNA that there was not an invasion, not even a large-scale migration, but just a steady trickle of people from the south into Britain from the Middle to Late Bronze Age. And they are suggesting that this could be the people who brought Celtic languages. I don't think they're right, but let me go through their arguments and what they've said in the paper. I'll occasionally check back on what you guys think in the chat and maybe read out some of your opinions. Well, someone says they didn't speak Indo-European before Celtic, or am I mistaken? You're probably mistaken, because, and I just want to make sure everyone knows this before I talk about what's in the paper, we now know for sure that Indo-European DNA from the steppes arrives in Britain and Ireland around 2500 BC, which is long before any Celtic languages existed. That would have been literally a form of late Proto-Indo-European spoken by the Belbeakers who were invaded. Not Proto-Celtic at all. It's far too early. You're talking a long time, like 1,000 years or something. Before that, that was not a little trickle of people. That was not a new elite ruling over people. That was a mass migration which replaced potentially over 90% of the population of Britain. And it didn't just occur in one little part of Britain. It seemed to occur all across Britain in a very short amount of time. So when that we've known about now for a while, it was probably published in 2018 at Aldator, but this paper is showing another thing happened after that, but before the Celtic material culture arrives in the Bronze Age. But it was localized only in some part of Britain. So let me get into it. So 200 years, basically, they show that 200 years of migration from France, they claim, without proper evidence of that. They haven't got a French sample in Britain to prove that. But what they've shown is like between the Middle Bronze Age and Late Bronze Age, the 200-year period of a trickle of migration of people who are more southern. And what they mean by more southern is that they have a greater proportion of Neolithic farmer DNA versus steppe DNA. So in genetic terms, Nordic or northern just means having more DNA from the steppe, and southern just means more DNA from Neolithic farmers of Anatolian origin. Now, the Belbeaker people who came into Britain in 2500 BC weren't all the same. They weren't all high steppe. Some of them were very high steppe, like 80% steppe, which is actually pretty much exactly the same as being a pure corded ware person from the steppe, because people on the steppe already had Neolithic farmer DNA. Anyway, so some of them were pretty much like pure steppe people, and others were quite low in steppe. Like they plotted like what we would now call a southern person, although that doesn't necessarily mean they were themselves southern, because at that stage everything was still being the modern European distribution of steppe versus Neolithic farmer ancestry was still being settled. Now, after So, sometimes we've seen in the Beaker folk in that early period, like there's cousins where one of them has very much shifted south, like he comes from France, and another is very more shifted like he's more Nordic from like northern Germany or something. But that doesn't mean either of them come from those places, because it just means that one of them, that they have the same paternal origin of a steppe warrior of some kind, but they have their fathers, who were probably brothers, married different kinds of women. One of them married a woman with less steppe DNA than the other one did. So at that stage, everything was still sort of coming together and like mingling, and different levels were sort of falling in place. And that's what happened over the Bronze Age. You get like that steadiness where like around in Iberia it ends up with about 25% steppe DNA. In Britain it ends up about 50% DNA from steppe. But in France, it's intermediary between the two. So it goes from southern France to northern France. And that's quite similar to now. Like, northern French people have a lot more steppe DNA than southern French people. So they're saying that it came from France because this 200 years of migration is people who have slightly higher, just a little bit higher amounts of Neolithic farmer versus steppe DNA than the inhabitants of Britain had before. And this then homogenized by the Iron Age to what they call about 37% farmer DNA. So it took a while in Britain after the late Bronze Age of these, what they call French people coming in. They don't have a good sample size from France or Belgium by their own admission. They've got a great sample size from Britain. It's got loads of new samples that we can be looking at, some really interesting samples that people will analyse in their own, independent analysis of these samples will probably lead to much more interesting findings than what the paper has published. Variants associated with light skin pigmentation at SLC 45A2 became substantially more common throughout Europe in the Iron Age. So that's one of the genes, the alleles associated with lighter skin in Northwest Europeans became common over the Iron Age, which is interesting. So we might presume that meant that very fair skin got more common. The kind of complexions you see now sort of started to become more common in the Iron Age, especially the ones you might associate with like people in Northern Ireland, where they're the palest. They're more pale than people in Cornwall, for example, today. Lactase persistence, the gene associated with that was much higher, they found, in Britain, in Iron Age Britain, than anywhere else in Europe. It was about, it got up to a high in the Iron Age of about 50% lactose tolerant, which was much higher than anywhere else in Europe and anywhere else in the world. So the most milk drinking people in the world in the Iron Age were the Britons, the Celts in Britain, and they think that might reflect what they call a dairy dependent economy or something like that. What it means is they're probably drinking more dairy than other people, which makes sense in a way, because they were big on their cows, the Britons. But nowadays in Britain it's about 73%. So it's gone up even more since then. And also, of course, it's gone up all over Europe now. So it's not like Britons are the only people in Europe who have that high levels of lactase persistence. But in the Iron Age, you can see that Britain was a sort of ahead of the curve. It was the most lactase persistent region. The most milky boys of all. Like my son, who drinks milk all day. So this migrant stream in the Middle Bronze Age began admixing more broadly through southern Britain by the second half of the late Bronze Age, as an individual from Blackberry Field, Pottern in Wiltshire, dated to 950 to 750 BC, had a Neolithic farmer proportion of 38%, consistent with the level that became ubiquitous in southern Britain by the beginning of the Iron Age. So compare that to the early ones they found in Kent. All these like migrants, it seems to be mostly in Kent. They're only coming into like the southeast of Britain. And that the first they find are two outliers. That means some outliers, meaning they're not genetically the same as other people in Britain at the time, dated to between 1391 and 1129 BC. And they're calling them like French, maybe, but there's a bit of a problem with that. But the early European farmer signal is predicted by the Iron Age to range from 35% in northern England to 56% in south central England. So it's much stronger in the south. You're not seeing the same thing as the Bell Beaker invasion. You're not seeing an invasion at all. You're seeing a trickle of migrants, and they're only coming to the south. And then that DNA is then blending in with the southerners, and then the southerners are gradually blending in with the northerners over time. So the migrants never set foot anywhere except the south, but the DNA of the migrants gradually works its way into the northern regions of the islands. It is predicted to be about 44% for the Arras culture, which is a East Yorkshire Celtic culture. We've got square ditch barrows. You don't see from the early bell beakers these square ditch barrows, and chariot burials, which also didn't exist before that. They didn't do chariot burials in the bell beaker culture. So it's a material culture which is linked to the Paris Basin, the Ardennes and Champagne region of the Iron Age. So it's presumed that the Arras culture is linked to Gauls of France. And the regional differentiation in Iron Age Britain, as measured by FST distance, is higher between East Yorkshire, where the Arras culture was, and other groups in Iron Age Britain than it is between any other pair of Iron Age populations in England and Wales. They don't know why that might be. Well, it's either going to be because the people from the Arras culture are specifically more isolated from the rest of the British people and then didn't get as much migrant influence, or is it because they got even more migrant influence? So the way that they're inferring stuff, other than FST distance, is just by looking at varying proportions of a Neolithic admixture from, steppe DNA versus Neolithic farmer DNA. But the problem is that isn't a very accurate way at measuring an incoming population who are very similar genetically. So that's why there's a big problem with this paper and what it's trying to do. Our identification, quoting the paper now, our identification of substantial migration into Britain from sources that best fit populations in France provides an independent line of evidence in support of this and points to the Middle to Late Bronze Age as a prime candidate for the period of this language spread. While the lack of evidence for Middle to Late Bronze Age Neolithic farmer ancestry change in Scotland could be interpreted as weakening the case that Celtic languages spread into Britain at this time, a later arrival of Celtic languages in Scotland is consistent with evidence that non-Celtic and Celtic languages coexisted there into the first millennium of the Common Era. That the claim that some people have made that maybe the Picts or some other population in north of Britain spoke a pre-Celtic language is not very popular either anymore, because Pictish place names seem quite Celtic. So we don't have any evidence of that. So there's no reason necessarily to believe that pre-Celtic languages survived. It's not saying it doesn't happen, but why have a theory when you have no evidence for it? It's like there's no names that indicate that, or there's no substrate or anything like that would require us to invent this theory to explain something. There's nothing that we know of that needs explaining with this theory. It's a theory that has that doesn't need to exist because there's no evidence for it. So anyway, our failure to find evidence. Our finding of a decrease of Neolithic farmer ancestry in Iberia, where the proportion was relatively high in the early Bronze Age, and the roughly simultaneous increase in Britain, where the proportion was relatively low in the early Bronze Age, could in theory reflect a Celtic-speaking group of people with intermediate Neolithic farmer ancestry spreading into both regions, as southward into Spain and northward into England. from France in both cases. That's an interesting idea. So they were saying, like, post-Beaker invasions into Spain and England, you get suddenly a slight increase of steppe ancestry into Spain and a slight increase of Neolithic farm ancestry into Britain. So they're saying that could be from the same population migrating into Spain and into England, because that population would be an intermediate admixture proportions of those two populations, England and Spain, and is having less steppe DNA than the inhabitants of England, and more steppe DNA than the inhabitants of Spain. But again, that isn't evidence of that, because it could be two different populations spreading Celtic languages, or even, this is the early Bronze Age, so we don't even need to talk about Celtic languages. There could just be people from, adjacent populations just coming in. Like, forget whether they spoke Celtic or not. Whoever lived in the south of France, inevitably some of them are going to cross the Pyrenees into Spain. Whoever lived in the north of France, inevitably some of them are going to come into England. And they're not even showing evidence of a mass migration. They're just talking about trickles of migration, which you should expect would be happening anyway. So why do we need to assume this has anything to do with a new language? We don't. We have absolutely no reason to make that assumption. They say, our failure to find evidence of large-scale migration into Britain from continental Europe in the Iron Age suggests that if Celtic language spread was driven by a large-scale movement of people, it is unlikely to have occurred at this time. So they're going against the widespread, consensus in academia has generally been Celtic comes in the Iron Age, because that's what the material culture evidence shows. And I still think that's what happened. But they didn't find evidence for it, they say. We use the term migration here with intention, because the movement of people into Britain we document was demographically transformative. We emphasize that our findings are not sufficient to prove mass movement over a short time. Indeed, our radiocarbon dating and isotopic evidence shows that at least some of the migration was drawn out over hundreds of years. So they're saying it is a migration of people, but it isn't. It's rather they should say it's migrations. It's a steady trickle of low level of migration, which did have a transformative effect on the population of Britain, particularly the south initially, but gradually the rest of it. So that's the evidence that they're showing. It's not really, the paper's saying, Celtic languages came in the Bronze Age then. That's not what's been demonstrated at all. In other words, the Brits are the real Asterix and Obelix. Funny. Yeah, I posted about how, the idea that Celtic languages came from France is not old. It must have come from France because it's adjacent to Britain, and it's much more likely that Celtic languages spread from Central Europe to people in France, who then spread it to England, than it is that people from Central Europe migrated directly to England and then, or Britain as it was at the time. So it's just not that big a leap to make, an assumption for anyone to make, that the Celtic languages would have come from Gaul into Britain and then to Ireland. So, I think that this has been a bit of a problem. There's a problem with this data. I'm going to talk about what some people who are cleverer than me have said in criticism of this paper. One of them is an amateur genetic blogger called Copperax, and he's pointed out these two main ideas for how the genetics changed in Middle to Late Bronze Age Britain. One, Atlantic Bronze Age connections of the sort that Barry Cunliffe tried to argue was Celtic, the connection along the Atlantic coastlines. They would have led to a general shift, with southern regions becoming more northern, as in more steppe, and northern regions becoming more southern, as in having less steppe and more Neolithic farmer. And a very gradual process which on a day-to-day basis wouldn't be noticeable. So that seems very plausible to me. That because we know there was trade up and down the Atlantic. We know that in Iberia they traded with France, and France with Cornwall, and Cornwall with Ireland. There was this Atlantic coastline trade. We know about it, and it doesn't prove a language spread. It doesn't at all it doesn't prove the spread of material culture as such. Although because they were already all beaker folk. The beaker folk came in from the east. I mean, probably originating in Holland and spreading downwards into different parts of Atlantic, upwards and downwards into different parts of Atlantic Europe. But they're going to start intermixing, and that's going to result in, like we're saying, an equalization with the southern people becoming a bit more northern and the northern people becoming a bit more southern. But they probably wouldn't notice because it happens so gradually over such a long period of time, hundreds of years, and they're all quite closely related. Anyway, it wasn't like a big event, and it shouldn't have been associated with any linguistic change necessarily. The second potential thing is Southeastern England saw migrations from the continent during the Late Bronze Age, as you can see in these samples that they showed in the paper, who are outliers. However, the local Y DNA remains intact for the most part, and most of these samples that the papers found, these outliers, are women. So that's a problem, because we're not going to plausibly argue that like the new elite who came in and brought Celtic languages were all women, and because the beaker folk, British beaker folks' Y lineages weren't changed by this trickle migration of the late to middle Bronze Age that they're talking about, and it didn't bring the haplogroups associated with Celtic people in the Iron Age that we know are in Iron Age Britons. So that's like really a big argument against it being a Celtic migration, in my opinion. So the average beaker folk bloke is probably not importing women from Gaul or wherever it was called in the Bronze Age. And what Copper Axe has argued is maybe these were long distance networks, trade networks, elite networks between beaker folk, Bronze Age peoples in the Atlantic region, and these women could have been either slaves or maybe more likely they were like elites sending women out, because we know that ancient Indo-Europeans practiced female exogamy, so women were supposed to marry an outsider, and men were get a woman from somewhere else and bring her home to your place, and then start your new family there. So if they had like strong trade links across the channel, then it would make sense for these kind of people to send their daughters to marry the guy on the other side of the channel. So they could have been marrying down in a way. It might have been a way to get rid of daughters. I think like in those cultures there was like a kind of problem of getting rid of daughters, and if they could like make any money off of it or establish decent relations with trade or whatever, that would be a way to do it. So we're seeing that this trickle migration is being driven by women for the most part. It says that the late Bronze Age, early Iron Age British samples have an increased amount of early European farmer relative to their WHG and steppe, and that contemporary French populations are the best working proxy for this. That proxy would then be responsible for a 50% genetic contribution in southeastern England. That's what the paper's claiming. 50% overall change from in southeastern England in the late Bronze Age from people from France. But if we swap France and Iberia and say that these people didn't come from France, they came from Spain, then that would go down to something like 30%, because they're only measuring that proportionate change by the amount, the relative increase in Neolithic farmer DNA. So the amount it affected the people in southeast England can only be calculated properly if we know what the source population is. So if we use a source population from the northern France, and it has to be a bigger change. And the further south the population came from, where people have even more Neolithic farmer ancestry, the fewer people would have been necessary to have immigrated to effect that change. And since we don't know, they haven't actually proven where the people really came from. So it could have been rather not actually either Spain or France, 30% from Spain or 50% from France. Instead, it was more likely maybe just a mixture of different peoples trading, going along that Atlantic coast or going over the Channel. Something like that's happening. And it might not be possible to say exactly where they're all coming from because there's this whole integrated trade routes. So, yeah, that's an interesting theory from Copper Axe and plausible as anything in the paper, in my opinion. So we can't be sure that it all came from France. He says, what I think they've uncovered is genetic homogenization smoothing out of European genetic structure, with the northerners becoming more southern and vice versa during the Late Bronze Age. The Y lineages associated with Celts come later in the Iron Age. Now, another online amateur geneticist who's very well respected and who has good takes on pretty much every paper that comes out is David from Eurogenes. And he has said their argument of the paper is potentially flawed because, one, significant population shifts need not result in any noticeable changes in ancient ancestry proportions. So using ancient ancestry proportions isn't a good way to measure population shifts. We haven't mentioned the other possibility is, what if even more people came, but they had the exact same admixture proportions as people in Britain? You wouldn't be able to tell anything then. Because, if there's mass migrations between Ireland and Britain, going back between Ireland and Britain or Holland and Britain, it won't be anywhere near as easy to detect as from France or from Spain. That's one problem. Two, ancient ancestry proportions can shift without significant migration from afar due to cryptic population substructures. What he means is you can get a little area here, a little pocket of England where people have a little bit more farmer DNA and another pocket where they have a bit more steppe DNA than their neighbours, and then suddenly if one of these pockets does really well and their population expands and replaces another part of the population, then you're going to see a change in the admixture proportions, but you're not seeing any immigration from afar. Another problem, large-scale population shifts need not result in language shifts, especially if they're gradual. That's another point, especially if they're with people who speak the same languages, because for all we know, the same languages were spoken all along the Atlantic from Portugal to Ireland during the Bronze Age. We don't know. We've got no idea. And also, small-scale population shifts can result in language shifts, especially if they're sudden. So you don't need a mass migration. Normans in England, no big genetic change, massive linguistic change to Britain as a result of the Normans. So we can always, even in the historical period, compare the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons, the Vikings and the Normans. Completely different impacts, completely different numbers of people arriving. Some of them had huge linguistic changes with big amounts of people. Some of them had big linguistic changes with hardly any people. And one of them, the Romans, had almost no genetic impact at all, even though a huge amount of people came. And then afterwards, nobody spoke Latin anymore, well, except the church. And, and it went back to the same as it was before. So, there's so many different things that can happen from migration, and you can't be sure. Proving a genetic change is not proof of a linguistic change. Proving a linguistic change is not proof of a genetic change. But sometimes they accompany each other. I think that the assumption that Bell Beaker people, where a massive genetic change, the biggest genetic change in British history happened, the assumption that was the introduction of Indo-European languages is very, very sound, because we can see the introduction of Indo-European material culture at the same time as the DNA. We should assume that they spoke an Indo-European language. Of course, that makes sense. But we don't know what it was. Anyway, he goes on, it appears that it's only the early Iron Age population from England that overlapped significantly with a roughly contemporaneous group from nearby Celtic-speaking continental Europe. So the only time we actually start to see the first people living in Britain who genetically overlap with known Celtic speakers in the continent is the early Iron Age. That is consistent with what archaeologists and many linguists as well, but not all of them, have argued before against Cunliffe's theories of whatever. The early Iron Age shift is subtle and only shows up in fine scale PCA. So the paper authors said they didn't notice any like big changes in the Iron Age, and that it was a time of like isolation where Britain stopped having migration from the continent. But David from Eurogenes makes his own principal component analysis charts, which look quite high detail at the relevant loci on the genome that would distinguish the different populations. So he can really see that there is a change happening in the early Iron Age that they didn't notice. David's also said that he has seen samples from the paper that weren't published in the paper, and that some of them that didn't make it into the paper were Pictish. And this is really interesting. I don't know why they weren't published. Of course, this is all off the record or whatever, but they are apparently, he says, identical to early Bronze Age English samples from before this trickle migration even. So you're seeing basically like the Picts in Scotland in the medieval era are a relic population that are the same as Bell-Beaker people from England in the early Bronze Age. That is really fascinating if it's true. And maybe then the Picts did have that, some kind of non-Celtic aspect to their culture that was from the original Bell-Beaker invaders of England, and that they ran up to Scotland to get away from the Celts. I don't know. Who knows? It's speculation, but that's really fun and fascinating to think of. There wasn't in the paper. How annoying. Anyway, the lineages, some of the lineages we really associate with Celts, Iron Age Celts in Britain, are G2A2B and R1B U152. And they arrive in Britain in the Iron Age. So they got nothing to do with this trickle of women, mainly women, coming in the late Bronze Age. So that's when the Celtic material culture comes, in the early Iron Age. That's when you start seeing all the things we associate with it. Stone heads they start making, like with the patterns and on the weaponry, like the sword, anthropomorphic sword pommels, like Latine influences coming into Britain and Ireland at that time, when Celtic lineages also coming. And on the fine scale PCA, there is a genetic change in the Iron Age. So the Iron Age still makes sense as the time when Celts came to Britain, not the Bronze Age. I don't know if there's a relationship, though, between these people coming. Let's say they came from France. I don't know if that's even true, but maybe they had built, this trade network or between like the Atlantic Bronze Age peoples facilitated the later movement of Celtic people into Britain in the Iron Age. That's possible. And maybe there's marriages, these women being sent over help. It's possible, but it's not. We don't need the Bronze Age migrations to explain when Celtic came, because it seems clear and more plausible that it came in the Iron Age. So I don't understand why they're trying to push it back to the Bronze Age, because it's not been demonstrated. They've proven there was a trickle migration, but that doesn't have to have anything to do with Celts. And none of these outliers are found in Celtic context. There's nothing in their burials that's like, oh, that's a Celt. There's nothing about that. There's nothing that we associate with Celts. So it's like, I don't see what the point is. Ian Amrit said, the results help to shed light on a debate about when Celtic languages were first spoken in Great Britain. The most established theory, based on the analysis of ancient object styles, is that Celtic languages emerged during the Iron Age, with Celtic speakers from continental Europe. But the new evidence supports a competing idea based on linguistic studies that Celtic languages expanded into Britain earlier, in the mid to late Bronze Age. However, we cannot tell what language a person spoke from a person's DNA. Well, I thought that was a good quote because it's showing like, this is like this new crazy theory, like, oh, wow. But, okay, some linguists want to go against the archaeologists and say that Bronze Age, it was a fringe linguistic theory anyway. It's not like all linguists saying that Celtic came earlier into Britain than the Iron Age. Some of them think that, some of them don't, But this doesn't support that theory. It doesn't really back it up because there's nothing about these women that shows they're Celts. The BBC quoted Professor David Reich from Harvard, and he said, shall I do the voice? No, I won't. We estimate that about half the DNA of people in the Iron Age in Britain comes from these new migrants. What that means is if you trace back the ancestors of these Iron Age Britons, 20 generations before the time they lived, half of them would not have been living on the island of Great Britain. God, it just makes you want to open the borders, doesn't it? Another person they quoted was Barry Cunliffe, Professor Sir Barry Cunliffe. I say he's respected in his field. I've not read his work in great detail, but I just think the Celtic from the West theory is bullshit, and I don't understand why anyone takes it seriously. Really, it just has nothing to back it up at all, archaeologically. He said, if the mid-Bronze Age move had any effect at all on language, then the simplest hypothesis would be to see it as a vector for introducing or strengthening Brythonic. So he's also so he's even saying that Brythonic was already distinct from Gaelic in the Bronze Age. I mean, I'm not a linguist, but I don't think you need to push the divergence that far back between Gaelic and Brythonic. I don't think that well distinct. Anyway, he goes on, and this is the most outrageous claim of all. If so, then Gaelic had to have arrived earlier, either with the bell beakers or even earlier. What? So he's actually suggesting then that this late Bronze Age trickle of women is the arrival of Brythonic languages, and that the bell beakers were the Gaelic speakers, which is pretty absurd because Gaelic isn't that ancient a language. That there's nothing, linguistics don't think it's that old, and like for Gaelic to have branched off, I mean, this is almost 2500 BC is pretty much like Proto-Indo-European has almost still been spoken. It's basically going to be a late form Proto-Indo-European. There's no reason for it to be so well, so distinguished from Proto-Indo-European that's already becoming Gaelic or Proto-Gaelic at that stage. But if that's not crazy enough, he says, or earlier. So that would mean that megalithic builders who have no step DNA and nothing in their material culture with anything to do with any Indo-Europeans somehow spoke not only Indo-European, not even an early form of Indo-European, but Gaelic. That doesn't make any sense at all. I can't believe he's saying something so retarded. That is ridiculous. But it's a cope or something to try and defend his old theory of Celtic from the West. I can't believe anyone said that. So anyway, Barry Cunliffe's influence perhaps might be to blame for this. I don't know. That wasn't in the paper. That was just him making a statement for the BBC article. He, I'm, as far as I know, he's a really great author. I've not read his work, so maybe I'm being too harsh on Barry Cunliffe. I just don't think he knows what he's talking about when he's talking about the origin of Celtic languages in Britain. I think the Iron Age is a perfect. There's no reason that the Iron Age can't be the arrival of Celtic languages, and I don't think Brythonic and Gaelic came in separate migrations. I think they became distinct within the insular Celtic world of the British Isles. But I'm not a linguist, so I'm not a geneticist either. But these the evidence from the genetics reinforces the Iron Age theory, if you look at them properly, which the paper didn't. And the material culture really just shows an Iron Age arrival for Celtic and nothing else. So, whatever. I previously have said as well that, like, this is going to be used in all kinds of ways to disrupt identities. A problem with some of the national identities of the British Isles is that instead of just being proud of what they are, like I say, I'm proud to be Welsh, I'm proud to be English, I'm proud to be Irish, they have to like hitch the trailer of Irishness to a mythical cart called Celtic, which they don't need. They can just be proud to be Irish. But by saying we're Celtic, you know, that's what makes us different from the English. They've set themselves up for a fall, because actually, by the looks of it, English people have more Celtic DNA than anyone else in the British Isles. Whether you count the Bronze Age population of French, if it is French, trickle as Celtic, or the Iron Age one, which is going to be Gauls, is still going to be mostly just England that gets affected. However, I said kind of like the Bell-beak, like in a way the Irish and the Scots might be more pure Bell-beakers, but they're not exactly the same people genetically in Ireland and Scotland either. They have, you know, interbred with the English a lot, and there's been a gradual flowing of DNA in all parts of the Isles over the course of thousands of years, of course. So, you know, everyone in Ireland has some English DNA. Everyone in England has Scottish and Irish. There is a bit of mixing up happening over the course of thousands of years. That's inevitable. So yeah, everybody has some Celtic DNA, but it's probably much higher in the southeast of England, where is also higher to have Anglo-Saxon DNA in the east of England as well, because that's the part where people enter the country. So it doesn't matter if we're talking about migrations of Celts or migrations of Anglo-Saxons. The southeast is gonna naturally be the part of Britain where is going to have, you know, the first arrivals and the most impact from those arrivals. That just seems quite normal. So you know, obviously the Celtic languages survived among you know, in the Gaelic regions and in Wales, like on the Celtic fringe as it's called more. And so wanting to try and amalgamate that with as a common identity of Celtic speakers makes sense, but it's been proven by the people of the British Isles genetic survey that there isn't a Celtic genetic region of the fringe. Rather, there are separate genetic regions. The Scots, the Welsh, the Irish, they're all separate. There is a part of Scotland and Ireland that overlaps, because the Gaels had this sort of, you know, occupied the Western Isles, but not all of Scotland at all. And you know, there's a massive part of Scotland that overlaps with England genetically. There's a massive part of Wales that overlaps with England. So you know, there isn't like a distinct the English on one genetic side and the Celts on the other. It's just not how the genetics of the Isles are actually set out. Yeah, when people talk about how much Celtic and how much Anglo-Saxon in England, they have to remember it's hard to work that out. But if we say we're 40% from the early Anglo-Saxons, then that means we're about 100% from the middle Anglo-Saxons, because they had already mixed with the Iron Age with the Britons by then. But if you wanted to know how much Celtic, are you going to measure that by how much DNA from the migrants from France in the Bronze Age or in the Iron Age? How much? That's really hard to calculate how much of that is in the gene pool, because it was so similar already. But it's going to be less than Anglo-Saxon anyway. But you could even go further back and say how much of those migrants from Iron Age France was from the original Celtic speakers of Central Europe. Even less. And if you say, you don't have to go back that far to find Celts, and don't call it Celt, call it Iron Age Britain. Just call it Iron Age Britain, then you say it's 60% Iron Age Britain, 40% Anglo-Saxon. But if you say Celt, then it's something else, because you're saying like there's something, a genetic identity of Celtic that existed across Europe, but it didn't. There was no race called Celts. There was no like one race. Celt was like Celtic languages and culture spread a bit like the Romans did, as a kind of like a material culture attached to a language, spreading all around Europe and even into Asia, so into Anatolia. So you got everyone from Anatolia to Ireland and Spain speaking Celtic languages, but they're not all the same genetically. They're completely different. So, and the original Celtic region is, I'm still maintaining, like I said in my video on Who Are the Celts, Central Europe, the north side of the Alps. They spread with iron. They bring about the Iron Age, and they got massive reserves of they got mines mining into the mountains for salt and for copper and things like that, and also they start using iron very skillfully, and their iron work becomes even adopted by Etruscans. People in the Italian peninsula start copying Celtic style iron helmets and things like that. So there's a clear evidence of a rise of a material culture which was associated with Celtic languages, and it's in the Iron Age, and it's not the spread of one race. It's the sort of spread of a kind of trade network and a language associated with that trade network, and its center was probably in Central Europe, but in Britain, I think that our ancestors who adopted Celtic were not doing so to connect directly with Central Europe. They were trying to connect with the inhabitants of France, who they already had strong trade relationships right back into the Bronze Age with the beginning of the Beaker folks, and probably also with Spain too, if not directly, at least via the inhabitants of Gaul. That's all I have to say on the matter. Let me check some of your comments. Modern genetics categorize whites as a race. They call it Western Eurasians. Yeah, it's the same thing. Like, they say that race doesn't exist, but there are populations, and the population of Western Eurasia is a genetic group. Just changing words doesn't make a difference. The word race, its etymology means lineage. So you can say a lineage, the population has shared lineages. It's the same thing. It's like, it's the same. It's just, I hate playing semantic games, like, silly. Oh God. Seamus O'Bain says there were connections to Spain going back very far, but we're closer to the British, etc. Yeah, I mean, there definitely were trade connections with Iberia, and there's the same material culture in Iberia as in British Isles, because it's this bell beaker culture. But you have to remember that the bell beaker left a much bigger genetic impact on the British Isles than on Iberia, and that the bell beaker culture originates in it's got its origins with the corded ware sort of German sort of area. The single grave culture of Denmark is very influential on it, and then it's coming out of Holland, basically the Rhine area, and to this day, people of the British Isles, whether they call themselves Celts or English or whatever, they're going to be much more strongly related to Danes than they are to anyone in Spain. We're much more closely related than to Danish people or Dutch people than we are to anyone in Spain. So this idea that the Irish are related to the Basques comes from very outdated genetic studies from like 20 years ago by Oppenheimer and Sykes and this sort of crowd. Just forget all that. It's not true. It's just not. It's wrong. It's just wrong. You can see. I would say you're probably the average. I think probably you're more likely to be more closely related as an Irishman to someone from Moscow than someone from Madrid. This to give you an example of how the north is all one genetic area and the south isn't, and that's because of this clear, easy to detect genetic difference from varying proportions of steppe admixture versus Neolithic farmer admixture. And that's what the paper's using as a way to try and detect Bronze Age population shifts. But as I've said, it's a flawed methodology. it doesn't. And David, I think David from Eurogenes gave a good rundown of why. So yeah, like there probably were some genetic exchanges between Ireland and the British Isles in the Bronze Age, but nothing major. The source of Celtic in Iberia, I don't know. It's probably France as well, isn't it? Like the paper said, I'd say it probably is, but I don't think it's the Bronze Age. But yeah, like I don't have a special like emotional attachment to Celts coming into Britain or Iberia in the Iron Age. They could have if it happened in the Bronze Age. I don't care. It doesn't. I mean, it's interesting, but it makes no difference to me. But I just don't think that's right, and I don't support that the paper's conclusions because it hasn't been properly proven. So Rustic Federer says, I'm glad he mentioned the Basque comment. It's an idea I still had. I mean, I don't know why anyone can think that, because I've been to Spain, love Spain. I've been to Portugal, beautiful countries. Everyone looks really different to us, like really, really different. Like when I go to Denmark, people think I might be Danish. When I go to Turkey, people say, are you German? They say, or when I was in France, someone said, are you Dutch? Are you Lithuanian? You know, people mistook me in France for a Lithuanian. No one ever mistook me for a Spaniard. No one's ever going to mistake me for a Spaniard. There are some Spaniards who look a bit like us, like, you know, they're a bit lighter or whatever. But come on, like, if you've been to these countries, just look at people. They don't look like us. Whereas people from, you know, Lithuania don't look exactly like us, but they're a bit more like us. And they're, I mean, you know, I never been mistaken for an Italian, never been mistaken for a Spaniard. I could get mistaken for some northern person, because northern people are all quite related. So that's natural. Conan says, why DNA has been proving much of the Irish annals and genealogical sources true. Some stories are likely propaganda or the result of bribing monks. Anything prior to the 3rd century is a stretch. Well, I think those Irish annals, monks wrote a lot of crazy stuff, like, you know, like an Egyptian princess and the Scythians and stuff. I've said before, I don't think that there was any migration of Scythians into Iron Age Britain. However, I do think some of the chariot burial customs and like the Aras culture and whatnot, since we know that chariot burial was not something that the Bell-Beakers developed, it wasn't from their culture, and it began with the domestic horses of the Sintashta culture, which were Proto-Aryans and the ancestors of the Scythians. It could be argued, and we know that the horses of the Iron Age, by the Iron Age, people, now this recent horse paper, the horses of the Iron Age that get spread around everywhere are the descendants of the Sintashta horses. So they're horses of the Proto-Aryan speakers, Proto-Indo-Aryan speakers of North Russia, around Sintashta, well, around the Ural Mountains, close to the Ural Mountains, really. So whether those spread into Britain, with how they spread it, how the chariot burial custom got to Britain, I don't know. Did it arrive with Celtic culture, or was something going on? I don't know, but that started with an Indo-Iranic language speaking people like the Scythians. So maybe somehow that's why the Irish annals start talking about ancient Scythians in the Scoti coming or whatever. Or maybe it was just folk etymology where they confused the fact Scoti sounds like Scuti and Scot, you know, like they just like got confused and thought that the Scots were Scutia, you know. So maybe, but anyway, Generally, I get annoyed when people try and say that the Scots are Scythians or the Irish are Scythians or something. It's just silly. I have an Isle of Man phenotype. I have no ancestors from the Isle of Man, but I can imagine that might have happened by mistake because I have ancestors from regions adjacent to it. So it is Eastern Ireland and Western Scotland. So maybe that could be why. Well, we're going for an hour. Thank you all so much for listening. I do appreciate all of you tuning in. I hope you found my stream was useful for your understanding of the paper, and you'll have to come to your own conclusions on whether you consider the paper to be right or wrong. But do check out the blogs of Eurogenes, and Copperax has one too, but I don't know what it's called. But yeah, very interesting. And I am working now on a big video about the interaction of Celtic and Germanic cultures in the British Isles in the early medieval period in the form of stone artwork, namely like knotwork on crosses and things like that, standing high crosses and church artwork. And I think it's really interesting, and it's a topic that people have a slight interest in, but they're not sure. And everyone always mislabels these things as Celtic or Viking or whatever. So I wanted to clarify what's Celtic and what's Viking and what's Anglo-Saxon when it comes to the stone artwork of early medieval Britain. So I hope you'll enjoy that. It's been delayed because I've been sick for so long, but I'll get back on it now that I'm starting to feel better. Yeah. Oh, someone's just given me the name of Copperax's blog is Museum Scythia. Museum Scythia. All right then. Good night and Happy New Year to you all.